Hello, everyone. Welcome to another in the series on Ethos. I'm Justin Foster, the co-founder and CMO of Massive. We are a strategic advisory firm that works with conscious business leaders that want to use their brand and their influence and their resources to create systemic change. This series on Ethos is all about how to become a conscious brand. And a conscious brand can sound a bit like maybe a woo-woo term, but it really is a brand that is led by people that have done the inner work to raise their consciousness. And as such, they see the world differently, they see people differently. And as I said in the kickoff session, they brand and market themselves differently. So through the rest of the series on Ethos, I'll be covering the key elements or key principles of ethos. And today I'm talking about having a school of philosophy. Now, a school of philosophy is it's kind of there's a reason I use this term, because most businesses run on this kind of strategy, tactics, execution, results, and repeat, usually. And from there, some brands become cults in some ways, and some brands become well-known, or they end up in the top 10 well-known brands list. But most brands following the same thing, strategy, tactics, execution, results, end up being lifeless entities that are propped up by a combination of name recognition and a shit ton of advertising and marketing dollars. But a few brands become this school of philosophy. So, and I'll tell you obviously more about why that happens in just a moment. So just for definition's sake, a school of philosophy is it's like a group of thinkers who share common principles, methods, perspectives, and they explore fundamental questions about why things are the way they are or how they work. And then they're kind of unified by a set of values. And one of the key traits of a school of philosophy is they're characterized by a distinctive approach or set of doctrines. And that's a key phrase here, because a distinctive approach and a set of doctrines, those are, in brand language, differentiators. They're things to differentiate your brand from. So for reference, there's many, many schools of philosophy, but several famous ones would be like Taoism, which is considered to be sort of the oldest philosophy. Tao means the way, and many of the principles are still thought of and used today. There's the original book, one of the oldest pieces of philosophical or spiritual literature, is the Tao Te Ching, and it talks about the way, which is a form of consciousness, really. Another school of philosophy that's made a kind of a comeback, if you will, in recent years, thanks largely to Ryan Holiday, is Stoicism. Stoicism is essentially the mastery over your thoughts and emotions, combined with critical thinking and a general curiosity about how things work. Buddhism is really a school of philosophy. Often Buddhism is seen as a religion or called a religion. I'm not a Buddhist, but I know people that are, and the common practice or the common thing is that practicing Buddhists don't see it as a religion. They see it as a school of philosophy. And then one that's still quite common, we don't really talk about it much, but its influence is still here, is existentialism and even mysticism. All of these schools of philosophy, some of them thousands and thousands of years old, they were created by true thought leaders, not somebody cranking out content on LinkedIn. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but they were created by true thought leaders or spiritual masters. I think it's important to point out too that in many ways, indigenous cultures all over the world were schools of philosophy, because there was this sort of unified set of principles, a set of doctrines, and a distinctive approach. Obviously, various indigenous groups had their own cultural identity, but there were common things like a connection to nature, or animism. Animism is seeing that there is something spiritual in everything. Sacred places and rituals, oral tradition and mythology, are in there. And then a big one is community and kinship. Those are all elements that would make most indigenous cultures a school of philosophy that's quite unified. From a evolutionary psychology perspective, I believe philosophy is not like a pastime. It's part of raising your consciousness level. And I've talked before about spiral dynamics and the concept of what consciousness is almost from a scientific perspective. And that when we raise our consciousness, we go from me, so changing how you see yourself and how you treat yourself, to we, which is the world around you, family, your work, et cetera, and then everyone. And I think philosophy is really an essential part for leaders that are in that we to everyone stage. Not coincidentally, those are the primary people we work with, because they're ready to go beyond themselves and take their calling, their ideas out into the world. Now, a lot of businesses have a philosophy. They may not use that word, but it's similar to Simon Sinek's Start With Why. A lot of businesses have a why, or they have a mission statement. They have some of these components. So why am I referring to a school of philosophy rather than a philosophy itself? Well, number one is community building. You think of the idea of building a school of philosophy is you're inviting people to community. You're not shilling products. You're not trying to manipulate people into buying things that they may or may not need. You're not playing on their fears, uncertainty, and doubts. So community building is a key. That's what makes it a school. It's bringing people together. The second one is a school of philosophy is a word of mouth, using word of mouth to build a movement. You think of these great traditions of Stoicism, Taoism, Buddhism, etc. None of them used PR people or advertising or any sort of modern marketing of any form. Yet here they are, still here today. And that's because word of mouth is still the very best way to grow a brand if the leadership and the investors behind that leadership are patient. And then finally, long-term sustainability. There's also a reason that most brands are not that old. Most modern brands are not that old, but the personal brands are. Jesus, Buddha, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., they're older brands. Martin Luther King Jr., obviously newer than Jesus, but this perspective, this historical perspective, shows that if you build a school of philosophy, this will be picked up by generation after generation and can be perpetuated. In business, either they haven't been able to do that because they haven't figured out how to scale their culture. They figured out how to maybe scale their business, but not their culture. They don't have a succession plan that's related to sustaining that culture. They don't have a chief spiritual officer that is responsible for maintaining kind of the flame of the business. And so some brands, they outlive their founders, like Disney as an example, or IBM or HP, but they haven't. They are still using more brand dominance than a school of philosophy for that sustainability. So real long-term, like legendary long-term sustainability requires you to build or create a school of philosophy. Now there are business schools of philosophy. They're not just the only, they're not relegated to sort of consciousness or spirituality or anything. Kaizen, the Japanese model of continuous improvement, that's a school of philosophy. Agile is a school of philosophy. My friend Bryce Hoffman and his red teaming model that with businesses is a school of philosophy. Systems thinking is a school of philosophy. You could include design thinking in that. Now, not all business schools of philosophy are based on goodness or good ethics. Although he has now rejected a lot of his views, Jack Welch, the former CEO of GE, had a school of philosophy that was described as feed the lions, ride the horses, and shoot the dogs. And he had this model of getting rid of the lowest 10% performer every year. And he is, like I said, he's since rejected that as a model. but there's other examples of business schools of philosophy that can be quite Machiavellian or utilitarian in their or amoral in their views. And I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a inherent sense of goodness, which I'll come back to in a second. Some of the greatest brands of our time are schools of philosophy: Toyota, Subaru, Patagonia, Honest Co., REI, Everlane, Allbirds. Less known in B2B, but Salesforce would be considered a school of philosophy. In some ways, IBM is still a school of philosophy, or SAP. They all have their way of doing things. Back to what I said, is a common set of practices and a common set of principles, and that shows up in their brands. The beautiful thing too is that thousands and thousands of small businesses, from solo entrepreneurs to a couple hundred employees, that 6 figures to $10 million, they are schools of philosophy. Maybe not setting out to write it all down, but they do operate in a way that is reflective of their philosophy. And you can see that where you get to meet the owner. So there's a coffee shop here in Austin that I like to go to called Malone's. And you can see this, the school of philosophy that the owner has created there, related to the visual aesthetics of the place, the high quality level, because they make their own coffee. They roast their own coffee. But the other day when I was there, he saw an employee that was on break, and she was eating something, and he said to her, he said, you, of course, please take your break. It's really important that you take your breaks, but I'd like you to use the dining room area so that people don't think that you're ignoring them at the counter or you're just slacking off. Because there's a reason we have the open counter. It's so that everyone can see what's happening and hear everyone interacting. So would you mind? And she was like, sure. She came over and sat at one of the tables. It's very small, microcosm of this example, but that guy, you could tell he had a certain way that he wanted things to be done that were reflective of how he showed up in the world, which is really what a school of philosophy is. So as I said, some business philosophies, in fact, many business philosophies, are not necessarily all that ethical. But a school of philosophy in the concept of ethos, this becoming a conscious brand, have an inherent goodness. And they have what I call operational namaste. Namaste is that term that is the light in me recognizes the light in you, which is sort of a baseline level of interconnectedness amongst people with an elevated level of consciousness. So operational namaste means that in each interaction of the thousands or maybe millions of interactions per day, internally and externally, those are all operationalized as seeing the soul of another person, not just their role, seeing them as a human with a story, having a holistic view of that human, and then that is then returned. And that stitching together of operational namaste creates a conscious brand in the process. So some other common traits of a brand with a school of philosophy: they're almost always led by a visionary. Now, again, some visionaries are crazy or narcissistic, but there's also quiet visionaries, and they're maybe quietly laboring to fulfill a vision that they have. Practically speaking, brands that are schools of philosophy have significantly lower marketing spends. As my great friend Andy Cernovitz says, advertising is the price you pay for being boring. I also think advertising is the price you pay for being soulless, because again, if you're operating from the soul of your business, It doesn't mean you shouldn't do advertising and marketing. It just means you're going to use it very differently. And the ways that you're using it are way less expensive than traditional marketing spends. And then there's a recruiting aspect too within these brands of attraction and retention of talent, where there's a line out the door of people that want to work for a particular brand. So for the balance of our time today, I wanted to talk about the key elements now. Now, of course, I want you to learn something from this, but also this is the work that we do when we work with a leader of a brand to develop a school of philosophy, to develop the ethos. So these are kind of samplings of that process that we take them through. So you can grab a pen and jot some of these down, or I will post these 5 areas in the caption as well. So the first one to consider when you're thinking about your brand school of philosophy is historical context. And it is asking a question of what ancient principles or traditions are you carrying on or are the next iteration of? There seems to be that these sort of mystical properties that humans are imbued with are picked up and carried on by various people over a period of time, over the centuries. And that there are different takes around some of the same concepts, or they're different realities based off of current conditions. But there's this sort of evolution of the mystical, if you will. And unfortunately, most brands, if you look at it this way, they operate more like a religion in this particular case. So they have this kind of, this is the way we do things. And they may even call it the, company name X way. And they, put people in training programs to learn how to do the thing like the last person. I think that's probably good for consistency's sake, but it's not the same as historical context, because if you were to stop doing it that way and stop teaching it as a religion, it would die. And you see that over and over again with brands. Historical context also keeps you humble. It keeps you from being arrogant. It does thwart narcissism, because if you see that you're just part of the arc of history, then you find it as a much more sacred place, and you honor that sacredness, and you don't necessarily say that you're the great inventor. You don't guruize yourself. And then another element here of historical context is what is your story? Now, this concept of story and brands is very kind of oversaturated, but it's important to remember that all great stories, all great novels, all great short stories have a similar pattern. They have a similar structure. And so when I'm talking about your story, I'm not talking about your, well-crafted marketing bullshit. I'm not talking about your boilerplate. I'm talking about the mythology, the legendary aspects of what you're doing presented as a story to the world, with the classic things of plot and characters and tension points and what is your story. Now, most brands struggle to tell their story because it's often not that interesting. And so they kind of fluff it up. It's like, yeah, we were struggling entrepreneurs working in a garage, and one day, or there's this sort of like, yeah, we built a prototype and sold some of it, and then we got $400 million in private equity, and here we are. And hey, great for them. But that's not really a story, not in the sense that I'm talking about. But here's the beautiful thing. If you practice this ethos idea and you build a school of philosophy, and you think about it being a school of philosophy, your story is natural. It's a natural part of who you are. And it's also about the people that you're serving, your employees, your customers, of course, your community, even your vendors. Those are all part of your story. They're the characters of the story. So that's historical context. And again, each of these is really a much deeper dive to understand where your historical context is. But these are the concepts for School of Philosophy. Number 2 is cultural identity. Now, culture is one of those like top three words that CEOs and business leaders talk about. And identity is really more of like the social label or social labels that we choose, or sometimes, unfortunately, they're affixed to other people. But cultural identity is bringing these two concepts together of sort of the collective consciousness that produces an identity that everyone feels like they're part of it. So the question you ask is, who are we internally and externally? They should be one and the same. Obviously, the processes are different. How you make something isn't necessarily how you market it, but the spirit of it is the same. Another element of cultural identity is a Spanish word that I learned from Virginia that I love, that we don't really have a word for this in English, is consequente. Are you consequente? Consequente would mean that your intentions, your behaviors, and your mindset or heart are aligned. And there's alignment within that. And that done consistently becomes then the cultural identity. Some other elements of cultural identity would include understanding the mirror, the reflection of what do people see in themselves when they interact with your brand. What does it say about them? One of my favorite brands that is a school of philosophy is Filson. Filson is they make bags and backpacks and clothes, hand stitched, and really just high quality. And there's something where you see someone else with a Filson bag and you do the head nod, a nice bag. And there's a sense like this is a statement about my identity of someone that appreciates culture and things that are or quality, excuse me, and things that are demonstrative of ruggedness, if you will, and to some extent like the tradition of what like Red Wing or Stetson has, of kind of the American West being portrayed through the brand. And so that's an example of that's what it says. And if your brand is not reflective, you will only be projective, meaning you're going to be sending out a bunch of assumptions, projections about what you think the audience wants or who they are. But when you're a school of philosophy and you develop your cultural identity, you are reflective back to people, and they see themselves in your brand, which is extraordinarily powerful. And then finally, there's this sense of free expression versus, say, message discipline, or you can look at it as liberation versus sameness. That within an identity, everyone is free to express themselves however they would like to, as long as it is, contributing to the good of the overall culture. Message discipline is important in marketing, but it often becomes a kind of rote or a set of memorized lines. And I remember I worked for one of my last corporate jobs many years ago now, back in the late 90s. I worked for a company that every month they had a company meeting, a couple employees gathered in the warehouse, and we had to repeat the mission statement and the guiding principles. And it was just sort of mumbled and droned, and there was no life in it. And so, yeah, there was discipline with it in the sense that it was done all the time, but there was no free expression. You also see this where the over reliance on scripts or talking points is, if you are a school of philosophy and you've taught those principles well, your customers should be able to talk about you as well as your salespeople or your marketers, because they're free to express what they love about your brand, what it says about them. All that is that free expression that comes from something coming from the inside being expressed to the outside world. Number 3 are clearly articulated virtues. So I use the word virtue here on purpose because it's not just values. It's really, well, I'll say my definition of virtue is values in action. And it's a neat theory that our behavior is the result of our values, but really it's the result of our priorities. And so, and you can see this when we get into maybe desperate times in a business in particular, and maybe there's a little loosening of ethical principles because the stock price has dropped or revenue is down. Virtue is the counterbalance to that because it's values in action unto itself. And so virtues can be things like love, respect, courage, dignity. There's a spectrum within them, a depth within them that allows people to adopt them in their own way, because the action part of this is going to be different for each person. So when you have this set of virtues, it also contains within it, if you desire to do this, a set of like mantras of how we do things around here. What we would call, I guess you could say, guiding principles, but they're really done in a way that's more like a mantra. And having clearly articulated virtues, it contains within it agreements on how we will treat each other. So there's an actual process here of writing down those agreements and that they're shared with everyone. And this creates a more of the table is round, and it means that the CEO and the lowest ranking part-time person they should be treated with dignity, as an example, and they should treat others with dignity regardless of title or rank or any of that stuff. So those agreements then become elements of trust. There's a reason that brands that are schools of philosophy don't necessarily have a lot of regulations. Up for many, many years, a brand that's a school of philosophy, Nordstrom, their employee handbook was very thin. Now it's bigger because of compliance. There's certain things you have to say within your employee handbook now related to government compliance. But originally, it was very short. And it was a set of mantras, essentially, a set of agreements on how to treat each other and how to treat customers. And that set of agreements also then goes into the recruiting process. You're recruiting someone, you say, this is what we believe in, these are our virtues, and these are the agreements on how we will treat each other. Boise State football, which I love. I lived in Boise area for 20 years. They're one of the most successful smaller school Division I programs for a lot of reasons, but they have a model that's been passed on from coach to coach to coach, where they refer to it as OKG, which is our kind of guy. And that is a person that has similar virtues related to hard work and discipline and integrity, things like that. And many times, over the years, if Boise State dismissed someone from the team, it was not because of their performance, but because they were no longer living up to this articulated set of virtues. The next one is consciousness skills. So, as I said, a school of philosophy, or having a philosophy, seems to be an extension of an elevation of consciousness. And so when you elevate your consciousness, you start to, and especially within a team environment, there are some things that you specifically need. And I think this could be a very long list, but for the sake of time and brevity, I'll give you just a few that I think are consciousness skills that are part of a school of philosophy. And one is critical thinking, absolutely essential. The ability to not just question other people's ideas or information, but the ability, the skill of questioning your own thoughts and emotions, and your questioning your own potential biases or blind spots. Critical thinking allows spaciousness within your school of philosophy. It allows room for ideas to flow through, and some elements are adopted and some are not. And it also, critical thinking is an essential part to keep your school of philosophy from becoming a religion or a cult, because it, by its very nature, prevents stagnation. It prevents rigidity. So brands that run on questions, that encourage people to ask questions, they are much more likely to become schools of philosophy. Another one is open-heartedness. That's a consciousness skill. It's, you can open your mind, but you also have to open your heart, because open-mindedness may help you maybe accept someone else or accept another idea, but it does not connect you to another person. And there is a interconnectedness within conscious brands that does require some element of open-heartedness, mostly around compassion, which, caring about another person's experience. And you can see how this would play out into a leader who's got a team member going through a difficult time, or an employee, or a customer-facing person, like let's say a cashier, talking to a customer and seeing that there's something wrong, and basically seeing the other person's humanity, kind of like I said about namaste. So open-heartedness is certainly a necessary skill to develop this long-term school of philosophy. Number 3 is pattern recognition. Now, those of us that are neurodivergent, especially with ADHD, pattern recognition is kind of natural for us, but I'm certain that anyone can learn it. And pattern recognition is essentially noticing trends within data, or noticing trends within a set of behaviors. It's a form of mosaic thinking, where you pay attention to the intricate details, but you still see the bigger picture. Because of the complexity of business and life, all brands are like mosaic pieces, and they're not really machines with parts that are moving. They're pieces of art that are constantly being built and replaced and changing and evolving. And pattern recognition helps you get out in front of things related to, say, decision making, or how you allocate resources. And it's a little bit like the old saying of reading the tea leaves. Pattern recognition is a form of sort of practical premonition. You want to be careful here with pattern recognition about biases. That's where critical thinking comes in, which is why it was first. Because just because you recognize a pattern, our brains are both dumb and smart at the same time. It doesn't mean it's true. But that's why recognizing it is important. Then you question it. Another one is creativity. Creativity as a leadership discipline, as an operational discipline, not creativity in the sense of making art, even though that's beautiful, but it's like thinking as an artist in your organization, in your brand. And creativity is the ability to create something original. So that's why we say that if you really want to build an epic brand, you got to make shit you can't Google, because if people can Google it and it's just a replacement, or it's another one of something that's already there, then what have you really created? So there's an element of originality to creativity. Creativity also applies to problem solving. It applies to creative ways of using resources. There's many places where creativity is an essential skill. And finally, intuition. Intuition is different than instinct. Instinct is your ego trying to keep you alive. Your intuition is really your soul. There's a reason that intuition over the years, especially within certain philosophies, is feminine. And it's feminine in its approach. And I don't necessarily mean gender as much as energy. But intuition is a real thing. And it is often misunderstood, and it's misheard, because most people get locked in, especially in business, to this very linear, literal, reason-based approach of the kind of show me the data determines all my decisions. But I always point out, intuition, if you use it right, if you pay attention, is data. It's not all the data, but it is data. So the last one here for building a school of philosophy is intellectual property. Now, I'm not a lawyer or an IP lawyer, so I'm using the term intellectual property because I think it's the best term for what I'm about to describe. And so, like I said before, a school of philosophy has a certain way of doing things. They have a set of principles or practices, and that then, therefore, actually becomes intellectual property. In many cases, that can be protected by IP law. One of them is category design. Category is carving out a space in the world that didn't exist before. And in general, not just in conscious branding, but all branding, the rule is if you can't be number one or number two in your category, you need to create a new one. And this is very important from a school of philosophy standpoint, because you don't want to be sort of like another school of philosophy. You know, people do this with brands all the time. They're like, we're the Uber of toothbrushes. Well, that's not a, well, that's gross, first of all. And second of all, it's not a category when you're just saying you're the other brand's, another brand's version of something. Category design is owning a place in the heart and mind of the marketplace and becoming known for the creator of the category. And again, it's a somewhat complex process that involves neuroscience and psychology and a mindset of understanding how the audience is thinking and what they want. But the key here that you can take with you today in listening to this or watching this is, what is the unconscious need of your customer that you want? Not their conscious need. If it's a conscious need, I guarantee you they're already being marketed to in that conscious need. So an example here, it's not really a school of philosophy directly idea, but it does apply. The whole algorithm of advertising on social media works this way now, where I have been trouble sleeping. I've been snoring more. So on Instagram, for some, you know, it popped up. I don't know how they know. They might be listening, maybe. But it pops up as a, you know, some sort of snoring aid. So I click on it because I'm curious. And now my feed is full of those ads, but they're all pitching the same thing. There's pitching the solution to the problem. You could, there's dozens of them now. You could take all of their names off of it and mix them all up and put them back on the marketing, and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference, because they haven't spoken to the unconscious need, which is much deeper than that. So intellectual property also includes your methodologies. This is why it's important to document your processes. It's not just for efficiency or productivity. Yeah, that's important, but it becomes a almost like an archive of the way that you do things. And in particular, if you can take a methodology and brand around it, it's extraordinarily powerful. Gartner, which is sort of a school of philosophy brand, they have the 4 quadrants as an example. And there are many other examples of this, where there's a methodology that they use, that they branded and they own it intellectual property wise, like literally. But most brands don't do that. They don't sit down and go, because they are not a school of philosophy. They don't think in terms of methodology. They think in terms of process. And, you know, processes come and go, and they evolve and become obsolete. But methodology it's got kind of an evolutionary component to it. So there's an evolution to the way things are being done. And if that's documented, that can then be perpetuated, carried on by the next generation of both of employees and customers. And then finally, brand equity. Brand equity is a fairly common idea, but I don't think people understand what having a great brand does for your business. A mantra that I've used for many years is, a great brand solves 1,000 business problems. When you decide to practice this ethos model and become a conscious brand, and you build a school of philosophy, there's a long game here. And the long game is sort of the energetic footprint of your brand, where it's not just name recognition, it is almost like spiritual recognition. So someone that finds your brand sees themselves, and then that's repeated over and over, and it grows and grows, and it ends up being an energetic footprint in the world. So all of the brands that I mentioned that are schools of philosophy, they have a huge energetic footprint that is made by word of mouth. That's what made it, not advertising. As I said, most of these brands do not advertise that much, but they build brand equity as a garden, not brand equity as a image that's projected out into the world. So wrapping up here, this idea of a school of philosophy, it's not a formula. It is a set of principles. So whoever does this is going to be a little different for each brand. You're going to have a different way. You're going to have different answers to what these 5 things are for you. But there is one common denominator amongst all conscious brands, amongst all schools of philosophy, is that in order to become that, it requires conscious leaders who are courageous, humble, curious, and consistent, especially the first 2. Without courage, you won't have the drive to be different. And without humility, you won't have the need to ask for help. And those are key components, not just in the school of philosophy, but in the whole ethos model. Those are the 2 of the key leadership traits that are necessary to go out and do this. So next up in this series will be brand poetry, which is a very, very different way of looking at how you articulate the message and language of your brand. And I'm excited to share that the next time. Thank you all for everyone that tuned in live. Thank you for those that are watching. Of course, if we can help you become a conscious brand, reach out to us. We're easy to find. And if you have questions or comments about what you heard in this episode, please reach out. Please leave a comment, or again, we're easy to find. Thank you very much.